Jeremy Clarkson this week say national service is a terrible idea. What we need to do instead is send the kids to work on the farm.
He's become a Maoist. He's become a Maoist.
I thought nothing would ring with Chairman Mao's ears better than sending the children of today off to the countryside in order to toil on the farms, or one of the greatest tragedies in human history.
We had such a high trust society then, and that he went on to go and create somewhere like Singapore where you can then leave your phone and your keys and your wallet on a table and wander off and it will never get pinched. We can't do that here in the UK anymore. So there's been a definite decline in those kinds of areas. And even if we do get the dead hand of government where it's bad in all the ways out of the way, I think we need to inject some more goodness in there, in almost like a kind of policy probiotic. The kind of algorithm that TikTok creates in China, it's like spinach. And the kind of TikTok algorithm that you get here in the West, it's like crack cocaine. And I think that it's causing a non-negligible impact as well. So your weekend is either, as an 18-year-old, going to be sat watching TikToks or sat doing something to help your fellow Brits out. I think that I know where I would want that to be spent.
Hello and welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Officer and Linda Wetson Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Over the weekend, Rishi Sunak announced that 12 months of mandatory national service would be reintroduced by the Conservative Party if they win the general election. The armed forces placements would allow young people to learn about cybersecurity, logistics, procurement, or civil response operations. Non-military volunteering would involve 25 days with organisations such as the fire service, the police, and the NHS. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he believed bringing back compulsory service across the UK would help foster the national spirit that emerged during the pandemic. So today we've got a very special edition of the IEA Podcast. We have a former or recovering special advisor, James Price, to my left, and we have the Director of Public Policy and Communications, Matthew Lesh, here to my right. So let's start with you, James. You are pro this policy. Could you explain a little bit about what it actually is in the first instance and why you think it's a great idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very glad to be here. I've not been on an IEA podcast for about 7 years or something. And I never thought when I came back I would be the kind of token wet or commie or whatever I'm going to end up being.
We'll have to have you more often. James.
Well, that's great to me. I could consider my own national service to come back. The idea of this policy was a big, out of the blue, controversial idea announced by Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, at the start of this campaign. The idea being either a year, almost like a year gap year in the army, with places capped to about 30,000, so it would be a highly competitive process. And for all the people who are aged 18 who don't go and do that, they'd be spending a weekend a month over the course of the year when they're 18, doing some kind of other, I would say volunteering. I almost fell into the trap there, but of course it's not going to be volunteering if they win, because it will be mandatory, which is why I suspect an awful lot of the arguments we'll come into. But from anything from delivering prescriptions to old people to helping out in the NHS, to engaging in search and rescue missions and anything else as well. And the point being, they'd be the first royal commission of the century to come up with all the difficult answers and how this stuff would actually work. That's the idea of the policy.
Amazing. And why do you think it's a good idea?
So I first heard about this just before it dropped from someone on the campaign, and my initial reaction was, sound. And I kind of, when it dropped, and then everybody else, all my old former, fellow travellers and bedfellows in the IEA, in the rest of the Tufton Swamp and elsewhere, started screaming that this was indentured servitude and this was slavery and all this kind of stuff. It was a really interesting moment in the kind of political journey that I've been on, from a sort of pure sound free marketeer when I worked at the Taxpayers Alliance, I guess another kind of sister organisation in the Tufton Swamp, from the time that I've since spent in government and in business and the kind of journey that I've gone on, that I had a very different reaction to this. And I think it's reflective of the way that I have seen the deterioration in lots of senses of British and Western society, and perhaps culture to an extent that we can get into as well, and where there may be meaningful differences. But for me, the rot is set so deep now in terms of the ties that bind us to one another across the ages, across the country, across, sadly, increasingly sectarian divisions of religion and even ethnicity and things like that I definitely don't think should be dividing lines at all in a country like the UK, that these sorts of fairly illiberal measures are going to be required in order to get us back to the kinds of country that we have been and when we have been successful. Now that is, I grant you, a pretty illiberal policy. It's a conservative one with a small c, and it goes against a lot of the kind of classical liberal beliefs that I have long held. And yet I find myself in support of it, because I just think that the kind of mechanisms that we would want otherwise in a nice civilized society to get us back to the kind of social cohesion that we have enjoyed in previous decades, previous centuries, we're not going to get to without using some fairly illiberal mechanisms.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we'll get into the practicality of the policy in a moment. But Matthew, I mean, Western society is failing. Western institutions are deteriorating. Isn't this a great policy to support that?
Well, I think that's a very pessimistic way to start the podcast. The collapse of
happy to help
civilization here today. I mean, I think fundamentally this kind of idea of a national service sounds superficially appealing for all the reasons James just said. Wouldn't it be nice if, young people today had a greater sense of community, could feel a bit better connected to each other? The problem with it is exactly where the government's been struggling in the last week, which is answering the question on the details about how it would operate. I think it's a bit of a cop-out by the government to say, we'll establish a royal commission to work out the details. It's like, well, you're going to announce a policy, announce the details of the policy with it. And then don't try and shy away from all the questions people are going to be asking. There's obviously a principal issue here, which is, and really, the government did use the language of volunteer in the most Orwellian way possible to mean compulsion. But even putting aside that principled objection about whether or not people should have the capacity to spend their own weekends as they choose, which I think is very important, and the way you support Western liberal democratic values, not to take away people's freedom at that level. I think on top of that, you've just got all these very practical issues, which is a lot of young people work on the weekend, particularly when they need money to fund their university studies. Others have sporting and community commitments already on the weekends, perhaps every weekend, particularly if they're pursuing that as a hobby or even as a career. And then there's obviously the people who have caring responsibilities and support their families, or quite frankly just want to do anything else with their time, are going to find this very difficult. I'm also just skeptical about whether or not this is practically going to be able to achieve all the goals that James is talking about. So we have an educational system, 13 years of compulsory education as it is, that is meant to, at least on paper, create this belief in Western civilization and liberal democratic values, and teach them about our history and our culture and our past. Now, we know they're not doing that particularly well. I don't know how 26 days of additional community service is going to change that. There is some evidence, in fact, that it might do the opposite, that it might drive more resentment because they're being forced to do it. It might be a bit like in France, where there's been reporting in recent weeks about their new national service regime actually taking quite a dark turn, with people literally booing at the national flag. Maybe as Brits we welcome that. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like things like rules, drug taking and sexual assault, which has popped up there, is particularly good. There was also another interesting study from Sweden, which found that military service significantly increased subsequent crime rates and led to poorer job outcomes. So I'm not sure that, even if accepting the framing of the issues that James has put out there, this is really the answer to those problems.
So then what do you think the answer is to those problems? I mean, do you think that, entering those people, those 18-year-olds that come of age to some sort of national service would actually support, or do you actually think it would help them become more patriotic and help develop those institutions?
It's just really hard to see how, 26 days of picking up rubbish or wiping people's mums and care homes is going to make anyone particularly more patriotic. In fact, it might do the opposite here. I mean, I think if we want people to be more patriotic, to believe in Britain, we need to solve the issues and the reasons, which I think are far more economic, in addition to the cultural problems that are driving people's frustrations. The fact that people can't get good jobs out of university that pay decent wages because our economy is too stagnant. People can't get on the housing ladder, and that they don't see like a flourishing future ahead of them. And that admittedly, this is a political problem as well as like a kind of like a cultural social problem. But I think there's a bit of a malaise about the state of Britain that needs to be addressed, and like a belief in Britain needs to be built up that will then enable people to believe more strongly in the British institutions and culture and the Western civilization that we're keen to defend.
So, James, I don't think you disagree with any of the sort of cultural or economic arguments. I mean, I wrote this in CapX this week that, people aren't becoming, conservatives, young people are not becoming property owners. And so the economics has a lot to do with culture. Do you think that the solution is that and not necessarily the national service, or why do you think that the national service adding to that would help develop those cultural, or I guess, love for Britain?
There's an awful lot to this impact there, isn't there? I mean, first of all, on the practicalities point that Matthew raises, I'm still enough of a small state free marketeer to be very sanguine about the idea that government isn't going to do very many things very well. I'm never surprised when government initiatives don't work very well, certainly to start with. Something like universal credit, right? I think that's one of the big successes that successive Conservative administrations have had. By the time we got to the pandemic, those systems and everything stood up really well, but it was a mess to get started. Very sanguine about that. The increase in academies and preschools, again, very difficult to get started. Eventually, the state gets better, and new technologies and things like that will help. So on terms of the practicalities, I think that, yeah, sure, it'll definitely mess up, and there'll be all kinds of exemptions as there are everywhere else, as there are with every other policy, and it'll all get watered down. I think that's one thing. I think on terms of the patriotic point and the way that this might actually have an adverse effect, I think that's really interesting. And I do think that by the time people get to 18, there is already a risk that the rot has already set in, I think, in lots of cases. Someone like Andrea Leadsom, who did all that work on the first 1,000 days of development for children, that's obviously incredibly important. But I do think that by the time we get to 18, people are looking and going out into the wider world. Do we think that they are prepared for all of the things that are to come at them? I don't think so. I think you've got kids in places like China who are working enormously long hours, working really hard to get the kinds of jobs that young Brits aren't even thinking about yet, that are taken for granted. And that the kinds of ways that people would be spending their time without something like this as an incentive to sharpen the mind, I think is pretty deleterious. So one of the other very illiberal stances I've taken recently is the banning of TikTok. And I know that as a TikTok star, there's maybe something...
I have dabbled in the TikTok.
And for those playing along at home, you can also follow the IEA's
yes,
TikTok.
You can follow the IEA's
before
TikTok.
James gets it successfully banned.
You can, but you shouldn't, and you should delete it off your phone. I think that all of the kind of Chinese spyware points about that to one side. I think that it is a kind of brain rot in a way that most of the things just aren't. It's designed to go straight at the kind of cerebral cortex of young people. The kind of algorithm that TikTok creates in China, it's like spinach. And the kind of TikTok algorithm that you get here in the West, it's like crack cocaine. And I think that it's causing a non-negligible impact as well. So your weekend is either, as an 18-year-old, going to be sat watching TikToks or sat doing something to help your fellow Brits out. I think that I know where I would want that to be spent. And again, you can say that's a nice idea. It shouldn't be about compulsion, and we should get into that as well. But I think that when James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, said, well, we compel people to do things all the time, and he was laughed at. I think this is a pretty good argument, right? We
compel people to go to school.
Compel people to go to school. You're now compelling them to do maths up to 18. We compel people to do certain things when they're in prison. We compel people who are in receipt of benefits to adhere to certain rules as well to help them relearn or learn in the first place the kinds of skills of time management and all that sort of stuff as well. Like, I would love it if we didn't need to have any of these kinds of draconian rules. But I think that the kinds of young people who are going to be volunteering already, my nephew, for example, nice lad living in a village in the West Country, goes and volunteers with the younger kids in the village and plays cricket and all those things. He's doing that because he comes from a loving family, two parents who are making him go out and do that. It's not even really volunteering because his mum and dad are making him do it. But there are millions and millions of people now who don't have those sorts of social or cultural things. Just as the state has actually receded in lots of ways from lots of parts of the country, so too have other institutions like the church and other kind of civic society as well. And the people are missing out on the joy and the meaning that can come from helping other people out.
So let's get into that. I mean, this idea of compulsion, and you yourself, you call yourself classical liberal, and yet how do you sort of marry those two ideas together? You're perfectly okay with compelling adults to do something. Effectively, in many ways, people can look at it as conscription in terms of the military. Obviously, not all of it is that way. The government call it voluntary. It isn't voluntary. It would be mandatory. How do you actually sort of marry those two ideas together, and how do you still call yourself classical liberal?
Yeah, I'm probably not allowed to call myself a classical liberal anymore. Former
recovering classical liberal.
After self-regulated to decide the criteria on which you're allowed to call yourself.
A former IEA intern said this to me: "You're no longer allowed to call yourself a libertarian if you ever did." And I'll let some of you guys guess who that may have been. I'd have that kind of badge stripped from me. But I think that the world in which I used to live in my head was one in which things were getting better, the better inches of our nature, that kind of Stephen Pink argument, crime is going down, everything is on an upward trajectory, all those sorts of things. And I think that while some of those things are still true, I think the other areas that are harder to capture and grasp are falling down. And I think this is one very small indication of a policy that can get into this sort of stuff. Again, would that we didn't need to do these kinds of things, but we do. And I think that's on the volunteering point. The other bit that we haven't talked about is the military side of things. I think that since the end of the Cold War and the kind of peace dividends that we've all reaped, we thought, the end of history, Fukuyama, all that, it's all going to be fine and dandy. That ain't true. And we have been really negligent, and the Conservatives have been really bad on this, unfortunately, in terms of cutting defence spending. And the world is getting more and more dangerous as a result. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you and all that. And I thought it was very, very interesting, just on that when this policy announcement was dropped, a friend of mine who was until recently a spokesman for the Israeli government, with all the horrors of the October 7th war, texted me and said, "What? This is rubbish. This is so weak. Like, why is it not mandatory military service for a whole year for everybody, like we have to do, and like the Singaporeans have to do, and like the Swiss have to do, and so on?" I think the things are getting much more dangerous, and the sooner we get people more anti-fragile and more resilient to these kinds of things, the less of a wake-up call it's going to be. Because let's not forget, just before the last budget, all this pushing from the army of, we may have to end up with full conscription, and you have both the kind of woke people saying, well, I would never fight because that's awful and Britain's a terrible racist place. You had a bunch of people saying, well, actually, I'm not really from here. My parents are from somewhere else, so I just go back there. And then you've got the sort of self-professed based patriots who are saying, well, what's the point of fighting for the UK? It's all going to go on diversity and inclusion anyway, blah, blah, blah. And well, who's going to be left then to fight for this wonderful country that has for so long been the envy of the world?
So, Matthew, let's talk about the moral arguments around compulsion. I mean, why is compulsion bad? Why is forcing adults to do something bad in the first place? We force children to go to school. And B, just that second point that James made, that actually we live in a more dangerous society now. Do we actually need this as a matter of urgency?
Yeah, on that first one, I mean, I consider one of the greatest British values exported to the world to be liberty. It's leaving people as free as possible within society to make decisions about how they spend their own time and live their own lives. Obviously, we don't live in a perfectly libertarian or anarchist society. There are places where we compel people.
Much to our dismay.
Perhaps not. I mean, you can, there may be perhaps an argument for, compulsory education to 18 because it ensures that children get 16, and then obviously you can then choose different options at 16. But it then gives options to ensure that young people have access to education. I think this is something slightly different, though, and I think it represents this trend towards seeing an infantilization of young adults. We start off with get to 18 and you're an adult, you can make your own decisions about your life. We now say in a couple of years' time, you're not going to be able to smoke. There's all this talk about changing driver's licenses just so that new drivers can't have passengers with them. I think at some point we do have to make, albeit you can say it's arbitrary, we have to make a decision about when people become adult. And when they're an adult, they should have this, as much freedom as possible to go about their lives as long as they don't impact on other people in negative ways. That's a pretty broad principle, which I would describe to. And I think this national service, for what I would think is very little gain. James is bringing up these massive issues. I'm not as concerned about young people as he is, or social media turning their minds to rubbish. But I don't think the national service can address that issue. On that second point, I think is quite interesting about conscription, about living in a more dangerous world, about needing to invest in defence. I think that's almost at this point kind of a truism. Maybe there was a bit of naivety, although I think we did benefit quite a lot from a safer, more prosperous, and more peaceful world. And I think we should be quite sad about the fact that world is not necessarily where we are today, and that we are going to need to spend more on defence. I think that's going to raise even more fiscal issues since we want to spend more money on defence, and that now we're also having to spend more money on healthcare and social care and pensions, especially with the government's policies towards pensions, with the triple lock
plus,
the quadruple lock we're getting as well. So you're having a huge kind of allocation from a smaller number of workers to fund a greater number of pensioners. So I think there's a whole bunch of fiscal issues there. In terms of then how do we go about defending ourselves? So we do need to invest more in the military. We need to think about ways to ensure that the military operates as efficiently as possible. And I think we're undoubtedly getting less bang for buck. I'm not sure kind of compulsory military service is the answer to that, though. I still think conscription raises a whole bunch of issues. And there's a moral issue that you shouldn't force people to be sent to war. But also there's even some practical issues here, which is that there's pretty good evidence just that what conscription does is not particularly cheap. So if you conscript people and you pay them a low salary, it does appear like it's cheap because you're saving some money in the short term. But the quality of those soldiers don't tend to be as good. They don't tend to spend as much time in the military. They don't tend to build up the same level of skills. They might not necessarily want to be there, therefore they're not going to be particularly great soldiers. And I don't think the solution is conscription for the UK. Now, you might say Israel's a special case, and you can say it works pretty well there, but I think that is a genuinely very exceptional case when it comes to something like conscription, where not everyone is conscripted, and there are concerns about the exemptions that exist, but it is a very small country with a lot of military threats. and needs a much larger military than would proportionally be the case in the UK, even in the context of modern warfare. Not everyone is going to need to be conscripted in the way that need be in World War One or World War Two. The modern warfare is very different. So in the context of, yes, okay, the military might need more soldiers than it has today, I think the way to get there is probably to increase salaries. That's got to be the economic liberal response here. If we want more soldiers, we should pay soldiers better and make it a more appealing career choice, not force young people to go do some kind of conscripted service.
So there are two different things here, though, right? So we're not talking, this policy isn't about full conscription. This is a year of 30,000 people trying to get this stuff, and therefore having a load of skills in reserve should they ever be required. And I think it would be...
You are making the argument that, the UK, the world is more dangerous, and so this would help that. I mean, if...
Yeah, I think, things get the greater threats, you have to start recruiting more troops again. We made a decision that we're going to spend more money on big kind of aircraft carriers and things like that. And I think actually, we won't go into this, but you should be more on things like a lot of drones and all that sort of stuff instead. But when you do then need to call up on people, the fact that they've had a good cohort, if we're now the army is sort of 80,000 people, if you got 30,000 a year people extra who have got some kind of experience, that really helps in terms of an overall readiness, as well as all the other spillover effects it's got in terms of practicalities.
But I suppose the question is, does that require some kind of compulsory national service scheme? I think if the government and the military wants to recruit 30,000 people on that basis for basically like a gap year in the military, if I don't know whether that I'm far off from a military plan, or I don't know whether or not that's the best way to ensure a greater national defence. If it is the best way, I'm happy to be persuaded that's how the government should spend their money, and they should create a competitive scheme where they encourage people to spend a year in the Defence Force before they go off to university. And if you can persuade me that's perfectly fine. I just don't see in my mind why that should be compulsory. Admittedly, under the government scheme, that's not going to be compulsory. I guess the compulsory part is the ironically the
if you've got to do something,
yeah. So I mean, I'm perfectly happy to be persuaded by that part of it. I just don't know why that needs to.
So you're making the argument that effectively not only will this help promote good culture and help promote young people's own sort of mindset and positive mindsets, but actually will also increase uptake in the military. Let's talk about the practicalities of this policy. Will it actually work? I mean, you said there's about 80,000 military personnel. Will they be able to handle the 30,000+ 18-year-olds that enter? I mean, I think the
also very smelly. I bet
well, it does. But also, I mean, I can't imagine the practicalities of that. Do we actually have the capacity to take on those people?
Well, there was an announcement just before the election of defence spending going up to 2.5% of GDP. Again, whether we want to be using a percentage amounts of GDP as a way of working out budget rather than working out what we need is a whole other conversation again. But I do think that the first role and responsibility of any government is defence of the realm, right? And I think that we have lost sight of that to a pretty big extent for a long time now, with the kind of horrors of the Iraq and Afghanistan adventures and the utter futility seemingly of pulling out of them afterwards. All these sorts of things. I mean, we need to probably start in this again. And I think the bit that I find interesting, and I'd love both of your takes on, is the way in which the classical kind of free market approach wants to address what I see as some of these issues about societal decay and decline. I think that we have been very guilty of just saying, well, those are very thorny issues. We just want to stick to the economics. We want to stick to the practicalities. That's what you just asked me about there. And we don't have anything to say on the way that culture is developing, the way that society is moving, the kinds of things that people actually really hold important. Someone like Jonathan Haidt, who says that people on the right, broadly identified, they have these other things like sanctity that really matter to them, that people on the left, it just doesn't have in the same way. And most people think the Union Jack is a sort of sacral image in lots of ways. The monarchy certainly counts as this for lots of people, all these things. And that those of us on the sort of, again, you call me whatever you want to call me, who believe this stuff matters as well, those of us in this world haven't addressed any of these things. We feel we've got nothing to say on this. When that happens, we create a vacuum for those on the left, those who I would consider our ideological opponents, who are very happy to weigh in on all these kind of things. So there are plenty of Marxist takes on how society ought to be orchestrated and developed.
From a cultural perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that maybe my thinking has gone beyond, but the emphasis on wealth and on the economics arguments have decreased in importance as I see other things. And I've got to a point now where look, there are loads of things we all know that IEA is at the forefront of, ideas that could make Britain a more prosperous society, and the prosperity agenda would really help with fixing a lot of these societal problems. But at the end of the day, I would rather us not be as wealthy if we could be more peaceful and more cohesive and all these things. I take your point completely. What you're going to say, which is that richer societies will end up being more peaceful and will have more money for police and all that sort of stuff. But if lefties are allowed to vote for higher taxes against their economic interest, then people on the right should be able to have these kind of conversations and trade-offs. And I think that will go into all sorts of other things about integration and assimilation of immigrants and all these sorts of things as well, which then I think that the free market right is increasingly out of lockstep with the country and doesn't seem to be interested in having those conversations.
So Matthew, if we care too much about the economics, the culture, these cultural arguments, what is the free market solution to cultural decay?
Yeah, look, I saw Jeremy Clarkson this week say national service is a terrible idea. What we need to do instead is, as said, the kids to work on the farm.
He's a hell of a Maoist. He's kind of a Maoist.
I thought nothing would ring with Chairman Mao's ears better than sending the children of today off to the countryside in order to toil on the farms, who are one of the greatest tragedies in human history.
Kids love Minecraft, and they love Nobody Loves the Mines. They love Call of Duty. If we'd have called it Call of Duty rather than National Service.
Well, I'll leave you to do the marketing, James. I mean, I think on the more substantive point you're raising, which I think is a genuine and important challenge, which is there can be a temptation to put aside the cultural issues and say what we need to do is focus here on the economic challenges that we're facing, which are real and substantive. And you can say there's an interrelationship here where the worse things get on the economic side, the more kind of cultural frustrations come out. I don't think it's coincidental that we have had pretty much stagnant growth for the last decade and life getting harder for a lot of people at the same time as we've seen a real growth in concern about cultural or problems in society. I think they're definitely related. I think it's much easier to deal with every problem you face when you have more economic growth. The pie is bigger, everything else is easier to do. I don't think that's a full answer, of course. I think there are other cultural trends going on here that should be of concern. I suppose the first response is almost like a do no harm by the state. I think there's a lot of ways in which the state encourages the development of that culture. I think...
In what way?
Well, a classic case here would be Gordon Brown's Equality Act, introduced in 2010, dying days of the Labour government. They never had to really deal with it. There's a whole bunch of expectations in there that come from quite a left to a far left perspective in terms of things like the public sector quality duty that every single policy has to go through, a set of identitarian characteristics and consider the impact on different groups. You saw a practical outcome for this in Birmingham City Council, where a key reason why it went bankrupt is because they took on this basically Marxist theory of labour that, two people doing a different job because we decide arbitrarily they're of the same value, and because it's men and women doing the job, they must get paid the same, which created this huge financial burden because turns out Birmingham City Council does actually pay people more who are garbage collectors because that's a difficult, challenging job and tends to be done by men, and then some jobs done by I think there are a bunch of practical things government could do, and in fact I think you could say arguably in their own terms the Conservatives have failed to do over the last 14 years if they want to push back against some of these concerning cultural trends. And then I suppose the other part of that as well is it's in my mind some of this is beyond the capacity of policy. A lot of it is about the way people talk about ideas and British culture and British history. I don't know that those things can be directed top down. We often hear speeches from government ministers trying to take leadership on some of these discourses, to use a left-wing postmodernist phrase to try to influence the way the discourse may people think about these issues. And you can say that just hasn't gone through. And I'm not if. It just doesn't seem like there's a clear policy solution here, which might be why we haven't spent too much time talking about it, because there's not a lot that necessarily can be done beyond the realm of the kind of ongoing battle of ideas that goes on.
So, James, the government, it is all the government's fault. The cultural decay that we see at the moment is the government's fault. Why do you want more of it?
Well, I think that this kind of decay has been something across the West as well, right? The American society, American culture doesn't seem particularly healthy right now. Look at the kinds of lax nature on crime that's been happening in somewhere like California, where shops are closing up and moving out because shoplifting is so bad.
Matthew's point is that it's directed by government. That actually a lot of these issues that we see within society, A, can't be solved through policy, but B, are actually often caused by things that are encouraged by governments top down.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possibly right as well. And that requires then undoing things like the Equality Act, all that kind of stuff. Completely agree with that. But I don't think that just revoking some of this legislation now, again, I would definitely do all of that. I'd definitely get rid of the Equality Act. It's hateful. Get rid, I'd still get rid of the 1947 town and country planning.
Yes.
We could go most hateful act of
all the time. We could go through all these things, absolutely. But even if we did all of that, the kind of society that we've got would still be pretty hollowed out in lots of ways. And that therefore I still think there would be small c conservative ideas that would be more required in order to get back to the good things that we used to have. And that's a very reactionary way of putting this. Again, not everything in the past was as good as it is now. Technology, equality, all the good kinds of equality, all these things are much, much better now, of course. But that kind of social cohesion, when Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, was studying at a small university in East Anglia, he was stunned when he saw that you could go to a little box, pick up a newspaper, and were trusted to leave the right change for the newspaper. We had such a high trust society then, and that he went on to go and create somewhere like Singapore where you can then leave your phone and your keys and your wallet on a table and wander off and it will never get pinched. We can't do that here in the UK anymore. So there's been a definite decline in those kinds of areas. And even if we do get the dead hand of the government where it's bad in all the ways out of the way, I think we need to inject some more goodness in there, in almost like a kind of policy probiotic. and here's the thing on this.
Get rid of the bad bacteria and inject some of the good.
Absolutely. I don't think we can just have a laissez-faire approach anymore. Maybe I would have done before the 7th of October. Maybe this is the moment at which everything changed for me, to see just how little connection so many people in this country feel towards the United Kingdom and the things that historically have made it so great. These are people who don't actually care about the freedoms, things like liberty and stuff that Lesh was talking about, and will use freedom of assembly and freedom of speech to intimidate Jewish people on the streets of London, who will attack the police, who will do all these sorts of things and feel they can do it with a kind of chauvinist impunity now. And that depth at which the rot is now set amongst people who identify more with religions, more with ethnicities, more with any of these things, than with the flag, than with the monarch, than with cricket grounds in small, quiet villages and a pint of bitter after, those sorts of stereotypes, things that really matter. And I think that's maybe been the trigger moment for me. And I don't think we've got any kind of argument about it. And I don't think it's good enough for us to say, well, there's a limit to what government policy can do in this sense. And I think that if we do that, we're going to end up with a society that is increasingly fractious, that sees more and more sectarianism into our elected politics, and moves towards a point where we are in sort of gated communities, driving from one nice bit to another nice bit, and everything else, the state's power has fallen apart because we don't want to have difficult cultural conversations.
So you've identified the problem, which is that society is culturally declining, that young people are too engaged with their mobile phones and are not engaged enough with patriotism and again, love for the UK, but also the desire to protect it. And Sunak is saying that national service is what's going to solve that.
Well, I think it's a small part of it, right? And look, there's plenty of blame to go around. As Adam Smith said, there's plenty of ruin in a nation, right? The kinds of boomers who we've got now who are stopping all house building because, the view of an empty field is more important to them than their children ever being able to own a house, and therefore turning all children into communists. These boomers act as if they have won World War II, right? Rather than being born after it and grown up with the protection of the American nuclear umbrella and a very generous welfare state that wasn't about to go insolvent in the way that, we now know the state pension's going to in less than 11 years, or something like that. And all these kinds of problems, plenty of blame to go around. And actually those, that again, I'm using boomer as a pure pejorative, but I think that's probably fair enough in some of these cases, that these people who think that they are great patriots and they love their country, not like the kids today, and they probably sound a bit like me half the time, but they're a big part of the problem as well. And no one would mind if we turned that ugly petrol forecourt into a beautiful bit of Knightsbridge. No one would mind if we built a load more cities of Bath and all these things. And no one would mind if we all felt that we were in this together. So whether it's a kind of Burkean small flotillas, whether it's, I don't want to say Disraeli's One Nation, because I think the One Nation Conservatives haven't probably stopped any radical reforms happening, or when Cicero talked about the Concordia Ordinum, right? All these sorts of ideas of having some kind of societal glue to bind us together. That the idea of this national service policy is one small bit of that, but the quid pro quo needs to be, don't, as you say, ban kids from smoking, don't ban houses being built and all these kinds of things as well. So it needs to be a whole nation approach, and I think that's the problem we've not got.
So, Matthew, just to finish up, if national service isn't the solution to this kind of cultural decay, what is?
Look, I do think, and as many of us, I think, James and I share an analysis here, which is there is a deep, structural problem. I know we like the term the social contract, whoever signed up to the contract.
I didn't sign anything.
Yeah, I didn't sign any contract or Rosario, I swear. But, I mean, there is a sense in which people's expectation of what they have to do in order to succeed no longer exists. It's this message that, work hard at school, make friends, do some extracurricular activities, get a decent grade, go to university, go find a job. Then you're going to be able to get a decent enough income to start saving up, to get a house, to start a family. That kind of life path that more or less in the past, if you did that, you'd be pretty well off.
Yeah.
It feels like it's almost unattainable to a lot of young people, particularly if you don't have some kind of parental or family wealth. It is just so difficult to get onto the housing ladder, which means you then don't kind of start climbing up in terms of your life stages. You get stuck much earlier on and very frustrated about the way your life is going. And then, of course, you have much lower fertility rates as a result. You have much lower family formation, et cetera, et cetera. So we have this kind of really deep issue that, unfortunately, I think the election campaign from the Conservative Party so far, and to some extent Labour and Lib Dems as well, is pushing against. What they're saying here is we're going to tax these workers a bit more. We're going to do some handouts to pensioners because we know that they vote, and they do vote indeed in much higher numbers, what feels like sometimes a bit of a bribe. And then at the same time,
Robert Colville tweeted this week, and I think it's from a CPS paper, Justice for the Young, that in more than half of constituencies, more than 50% of those voters that are likely to vote, so based on historic trends of turnout, are over 55.
Yeah.
Which is mental.
Of course, the inverse here is the poll that came up from YouGov this week that said the Conservatives are on was it 8-9%? And the Greens are on 12%. That's under 50s. That's not under 30s. That's under 50s. And that kind of result is going to be analysed, I think, quite a lot after the election, because it's going to say the Conservatives will still do okay amongst that older age group that they're trying to hold on to at the moment. But if they can't appeal to that younger age group and give them a reason to vote Conservative, they're going to be pretty hacked off themselves. And I think Labour's been a little bit smarter here, talking a lot more about housing because they know that appeals to young people. Lib Dems, of course, not talking about housing because they're
because their voters are NIMBY.
Because their voters are older and NIMBY as well. So they're, I think finding ways to address that fundamental kind of structural unfairness going on in society is so important. I wouldn't say national service is anywhere near the answer to that, I suppose, would be my conclusion in this debate. But there is that real serious problem that we need to think about.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And maybe just to finish up the other bits of thinking that are necessary parts of all of this is where the classical liberal tradition butts up against the kind of small c conservative. Someone like James Orr would say limits are liberating. For everything from traffic lights stopping you to all these sorts of things. Again, and that goes into a very paternalist area.
Yeah.
But the last bit that I started to think about now, for the first time I've read Atlas Shrugged, right? And most people...
I'm a big Rand fan.
They either say it's 1,200 pages of trains and selfishness, or they say it's the best thing ever. And I thought it was a lot better than the critics who've never bothered to read it thought.
Yes.
And they said that what her
have you seen the movies?
Not yet. You can say it. That her heroes may not exist, but the villains definitely do. And I think that's right. And that kind of idea that you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all that stuff. There's a lot to be said for that. But it butts up very much against the sort of Christian ideas that service is the kind of highest form of living, and that's the best way that you can help other people and all the rest of it. And that if the church and any kind of other sorts of institutions that have grown out of the wellspring of that ideology have all withered away, how else are we to convince people that helping others, that serving others, that forgiving those who don't deserve to be forgiven, concepts like grace, all these wonderful things that have been so, I think, increasingly fundamentally necessary to the success of the West, how are we going to pass that on to future generations without a little bit of cajoling from the state? And that's an interesting question that I would maybe hope that people in comment sections and things like that can turn to, because I think that's the big concern I've got, and why I've got a lot more sympathy for this national service policy and for things like that than I would have done when I've been a pure free marketer.
James, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today on the IEA Podcast, and thank you to all you lovely people for listening or watching. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, then please do subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and please do leave us a comment. Do you think that we should be reintroducing national service in the way that Sunak has announced? Thank you.
Thank you.